I now have a bunch of apple to eat up on stage, so maybe I'll take that with me afterwards. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Dalia. I am the head of marketing at a company that most of you probably haven't heard of, and a company that most people, this is very loud, most people in the world have not. That company is called Vow. Now, a little bit of context on me. I used to lead marketing for one of the most iconic, globally renowned brands that most people could draw the bottle of in their sleep. A brand and a food that was and still is, highly routine, highly familiar. That brand, oh, that's my first slide. That brand is Heinz Ketchup. And then I pivoted to the most niche company in the world, based out of Sydney, Australia, for a company that had not sold a single dollar, a brand that did not exist, and a food that did not exist before. And that company was called Vow, destined to create this thing and this global phenomenon out of this thing called cultured meat. Now, as you can imagine, I lived by this traditional marketing playbook. In many cases, I feel like I wrote the playbook on how to market food, having worked at Heinz. But moving to Vow, destined to create and launch an entirely new category of food, I had to throw every single page of that playbook out. And then I went to work for Vow, who was destined to create entirely new meats within an entirely new category of food, and had to throw the entire playbook out itself. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, which is lessons learned now a year in, almost to the day, of serving the unknown to the consumer and what it takes to actually create mass appeal for something that's so novel. Now, before I get started, you're probably wondering, if you're not familiar already, what the hell is cultured meat? But before I answer that, I wanted to ask a very simple question. Oh, I think this might be a whole deck. When was the last time you tasted something for the first time? I'll pause, give you all a second to think about it. You can come find me after and maybe tell me. The reality is most of us can't actually remember in our adult lives. And Vow and our first brand Forged essentially exist to change just that. Rather than seeking to replicate or replace the meat that we already know today, Vow and our first brand Forge exists to add to our diets by creating entirely new meats that meat eaters can choose selfishly, entirely for their own personal benefit. Now, let me talk you through just a little bit of our logic and the reason why. Just 4 species make up the majority of the meat that we know today and that we eat today: lamb, chicken, beef, and pork. But have we ever really stopped and questioned, is that the most delicious meat that we could be eating? What about the 0.2%? What about the remaining 99% of the animal kingdom that we don't regularly eat today? What's so special about chicken, lamb, beef, and pork? The reality is we probably don't eat these meats because they're the most delicious out of the entire animal kingdom, but because they maybe wandered onto our villages, became the easiest to domesticate, and essentially have become the most efficient to produce. They've become our answer to supplying what Lee spoke about as exponentially growing meat demand, doing so affordably and at scale. But in the process, has essentially abolished the variety of meats that our ancestors used to so regularly eat in their diets that we've essentially completely rid of our diets today. Now, to answer this tension that we're all here trying to solve, growing demand for food, increasingly challenging ability to supply it, we could ask everybody to start to reduce their meat consumption and to stop eating meat altogether. But we at Vow love meat, and simply we're just not going to do that. We're not going to compromise on the food that we so love in our diets today. just replicating animals with alternative proteins or other solutions that force us to eat not just a beef patty, but an almost beef patty is just unrealistic. It's not going to create the change that we need, especially for the most devout meat eaters. We believe that the meat that we're eating today is just a fraction of the most nutritious, delicious meat that we could be eating. So what if, for a second, we thought about, what if in addition to eating the chicken that we already know and love, or a replica of that chicken, we actually could craft meats that meat eaters love even more. Now, cultured meat, just to talk you through a little bit of what that process is, cultured meat is the process of essentially allowing us to craft meat outside of the body of an animal. We essentially take the same muscle, fat, and connective tissue that grow within animals and essentially just grow that outside of the body of an animal. Doing this, suddenly every single animal is now on the table. We can grow meat to accentuate the best parts of its taste or the best parts of its nutritional profile, and do that to create entirely new and utterly delicious that we don't regularly have access to today. A little bit about the process, because most people probably are unfamiliar with the process of culturing meats. We scour the 99% of animals that we don't regularly eat and find the perfect cell. Much like finding the most perfect seed to grow the best tomato, we equally will try and scour the 99% of the animal kingdom and find the perfect cell. We then take those cells and nourish that with a nutrient-rich broth, complete with amino acids and nutrients that those cells need to thrive, and really reflects the same sorts of nutrients that animals typically get in their diets today. That meat then continuously grows in fermentation tanks. It doubles every 24 hours, and after 30 days, we can essentially harvest that meat again and again and again, much like a sourdough starter. It continues to replenish itself, and from a single cell, we can get thousands of kilos of meat after only 30 days. We then take that harvested meat and we craft it into entirely new food. That gives us, essentially, a kaleidoscope of choice now that wasn't previously on the table, whereby we can create meats that exactly match our unique preferences, our unique goals, our unique lifestyles in ways that the meat that we eat today hasn't yet done. So 12 months ago, we took quite a bit of a leap of faith and brought in an ingredient to the world that not a single person had tried before, except for the many chefs that we have behind the scenes at Vow. And that really took a huge leap forward, launching Japanese quail, which hopefully many of you have tried already to date, that brought to life an entirely new flavor, an entirely new taste profile, and a new texture, unlike anything the world had experienced before. So naturally, as a marketer that had worked on Heinz and had many, many comforts and pleasantries as part of that role, was stripped of the comforts I did not realize I took for granted. Usually when we're all buying something at the grocery store or on a menu, we know exactly what we're buying. We understand what the food is, we've maybe tasted it before. In this case, there was absolutely none of that. People did not have the vocabulary or the language to actually describe what the food what tasted like. They had no analogs or references to compare the product to. Zero brand awareness. And the understanding of how you actually made this meat was entirely difficult to understand. Some may say that it was a marketer's worst nightmare, or the most exciting challenge in my case. So we did just that, and we brought it to market. And we thought that our task was going to convince the most discerning diners that trying something novel and trying something new was okay, and really hold their hands to be able to get there. So we served it amongst diners with highly discerning palates those who had an appreciation for adventure, for the avant-garde, for the non-traditional, to really bring who we thought were going to be our early adopters into something so new. We served the Japanese quail parfait or the Japanese quail foie gras, amongst other fine foods and delicacies, where luxury and quality take center stage and give people the best experience they possibly could have with an entirely new ingredient. We then made it exclusive to a select few, really leaning on influence and word of mouth to spread like wildfire, focusing on those who could really value scarcity in a very limited edition, or limited way. We leaned very heavily into brand storytelling, talking about the why behind our philosophy of cultured meat, our philosophy around creating entirely new foods, and really focusing on the craftsmanship and inspiring with the potential of the future that cultured meat could create. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, is that we sought to over-educate people. We opted to give more education over less, really over-engineering information about the process and the origin of making cultured meat to give people the knowledge that we thought they would need in order to make a decision and take that leap of faith themselves. The reality, literally no one cared. And if you've been to a two-man bagel house in the last month, hopefully you've seen this as well. We have been selling our product out. People were curious, so maybe they ordered the dish, or they saw the dish and they ordered it, or they heard about it and they ordered it, or in most cases, they took one bite and they just kept eating. Rarely did people ask any questions whatsoever, and if they did, usually a one-liner usually quelled their curiosities, and that's really all it took. And so with an intriguing enough description of the food, a delicious dish, and crafting a bite that people could not stop biting and could not stop eating, orders took off, menus were selling out, samples go like wildfire, and people just continue to lick their fingers, which is the most rewarding part of the job. In the best way possible, cultured meat has essentially become mundane, and that's a good thing. Japanese quail has become just another ingredient that can create a really freaking delicious dish, and it's become relatively irrelevant. And in the process, the fact that we're able to culture meat has also solved problems related to convenience and accessibility, consistency of supply, accessibility, and consistency of the quality that you get every single time without the variability of the meat that they're ordering or that they're using today. In many ways, this proved so many of our convictions absolutely wrong about how hard it is or what it takes to get somebody to try something entirely new and novel. But in other ways, it proved many of our convictions quite right, which is what are the drivers of true human behavior that's guided Vow and forged philosophy since day one. The first lesson is that at the end of the day, our own needs reign. In every instance, few opted to try or buy Japanese quail simply because it was a more sustainable or ethical method of supplying exponentially growing meat demand. In fact, every purchase decision benefited their own personal needs in some way that many people in this room are probably experiencing either personally or with their businesses. Maybe it helped bring in entirely new diners that were younger, more open to trying new things. Maybe it meant they could charge a higher price on their menu and therefore bring in a little bit more top line to the restaurant. Maybe it meant there was just a new ingredient to play with that gave chefs a new sense of culinary adventure and ingenuity. Maybe it helped consumers experience an entirely new flavor and fuel their desire for adventure and their appetite. And maybe it just helped people prep a really delicious parfait back of house and save time on labor costs, which are rising every single day. In every case, giving people a solution that satisfied their own personal motivations always trumped a higher moral calling. The second lesson is that if it tastes good, they will come. And there's nothing I have more conviction about than this statement. We as humans, myself included, just want good food. We want to try new things. We want a bite that we can tell our friends about and that we can dream about. In our case, sharing delectable products and dishes that showed off our new meat's unique flavor was all that mattered. In our case, nothing else mattered but the word of the day so far, which is it was delicious. This now guides every single decision that we make in the new foods that we have coming out, which is to make foods that are entirely new and utterly delicious, and for no other reason than to serve consumer preferences. Related is that our process is simply a means to an end. The process by which we make our products is not our selling point. The product itself is. It has to be in service of creating a better outcome for the consumer or for the end user. In our case, culturing is only valuable so much that it can create and offer something that's entirely new, utterly delicious, has an endless supply, is convenient, is more accessible, is more consistent, you name it. But the fact that it's cultured, as I mentioned before, is essentially, it needs to be irrelevant. We had fallen orphan, unfortunately, to others who had come before us that overstated the value of an ethical process and its role in consumer decision-making. And in our case, culturing is not the thing that makes us special. The food that it creates is. The next lesson in creating change around novel foods is that influence matters. Coming in as a new brand or a new company, we had, and still continue to have, very, very little influence, if not none, on convincing us what we should actually be eating. We all have our own agency, and so we were not the ones that were going to tell people, you should stop doing this, you should start eating this, etc. Making sure that we align ourselves with those that people are looking towards to get their guidance on what they should be eating or what's new and exciting in the world of food continues to have so much influence over creating mass appeal for something that's entirely novel. And it's been needed to really permeate food culture authentically. We would be kidding ourselves if we thought we could come in a year ago and just be screaming from the rooftops from the brand Forged that cultured meat is the next best thing. Instead, we've partnered with chefs, restaurateurs, up-and-coming restaurants, people, brands that can really serve as the voice to help us get credibility and authenticity and do so and introduce something new in a very real way. The last piece, and perhaps the most important one, is that humans are selfish. Some may have saw this challenge of bringing something entirely new, launching something entirely unknown with an entirely new category of food as just too daunting, said, I'm going to throw up my hands, it's too hard to do. But from that traditional marketing playbook that I threw out, there is one lesson that has not changed, which is the fact that people don't change behavior. People are creatures of habit. And in our case, that meant and that continues to mean never getting people to compromise or change their love of meat. Never having people to compromise on delicious food or ask them to taste something that's worse off for them or not as good as the things that they're eating today. Instead, we want to be giving people more options, better options, that satisfy those same selfish desires that people have had for centuries. Sustenance, health, nutrition, convenience, I said health and nutrition, and taste, most importantly. We want to be able to supplement the meat industry with a very real solution to feeding an exponentially growing demand for meat. And in our case, we just chose to satisfy those exact same desires and same selfish needs, but do so in a very deliberately different way. So that's what I got for you today.
Thank you, Dalia. Could we get the...
I don't think I'm equipped to answer too many questions
No,
on soil.
let's not
I'll turn
answer
to you on that
Matthew's
one.
questions. Jade, could we get the questions for Dalia? This is Matthew. So while they're sorting that out, I'm curious. Like one of the things that you mentioned earlier is you have like an endless supply. Now I'm curious about the process because an endless supply would mean that you're at some point some resource is going to be used, right? And at some point that resource will be depleted, considering it becomes of a scale that that none of us considered. So what about that process that allows you to say that there will be like an endless supply?
Absolutely. In our case, the process of culturing itself, the reason that allows us to get an endless supply is that one single animal cell can grow meat essentially in perpetuity. So as long as we continue to harvest, the meat continues to double itself and essentially becomes this perpetual source of meat from one single source that didn't have any animal harm in the process. And so that perpetuity that we can get means that our capacity for being able to produce meat at scale is really only limited by our own physical infrastructure and the capacity with which we have the fermentation tanks to produce it. So right now, we have been operating at a relatively small scale, and just in the last week, we've actually now produced the largest harvest of cultured meat in history from what's now the largest operational food-grade cell culture reactor at Vow, based in Sydney. And so the more of those that we can continue to replicate, the larger our ability to supply meat endlessly grows.
Great, and I think a really pertinent question right here. Just move to number 2. Why did you stop at Japanese quail and not giraffe?
We had to start somewhere. The Japanese quail is just the beginning. If any of you are familiar, we did launch a mammoth meatball a couple of years ago, which was a meatball made from the DNA of a woolly mammoth, which can just show you just how far we can go. We started at Japanese quail very deliberately, which is, this is something entirely new. Eating something like a giraffe might take a little bit of time to actually get there, and so we wanted to really introduce an ingredient that was familiar enough, but still new enough to really start to understand what's possible and condition us to take one small step before we ask ourselves.
It would be a marketing dream, right, to sell giraffe on
that is definitely in the horizon,
in a supermarket.
hopefully.
It's like pop by fair price and pick up a giraffe. How many chemicals are used in this creation of the cultured meat?
Yep. So the short answer is the nutrient-rich broth that I mentioned is actually a natural source that has all of the same nutrients and amino acids that animals eat traditionally, so you're going to find very familiar ingredients in there. So the short answer is it's not made in a lab. That's factually incorrect, and it's not made with chemicals. It's actually one of the cleanest processes of making meat because it's not exposed to additional things from the environment, and it's actually quite a sterile way of making it.
That's interesting. How much? Well, this was something I was looking at that I was thinking about earlier. I mean, I know it was only a year, right? But then how would we then be able to see if there was repeat guests ordering the same product? And how much of that is based on novelty, at least on the first purchase? Or is that what you were also aiming for?
Yep. Yeah, we totally agree. Novelty can only get us so far. What we've seen is that even now, after being a year on market, there are certain restaurants that have kept us on menu for the entirety of that. So we've maintained, I think, roughly 90 to 95% retention, which means that customers are continuing to come back and order it, which is a signal of the order rates that they're then getting at their restaurants. And we're continuing to see that the novelty of it does convince somebody maybe to come in, but there's still so many people we can be serving this to. And the goal is to really make Japanese quail an ingredient that people are regularly eating because it just tastes good. So the novelty might be something interesting at the beginning, but by no means are we relying on it, and by no means are we seeing that actually play out in market.
Also, then would also want to consider that. I mean, just from the example that you showed us, it was a burger, and it had like, well, not a burger, but like a sandwich with like roast beef on it.
Yep.
So if I understand you correctly, we are looking at it as an ingredient, but perhaps not maybe necessarily the main ingredient or a singular ingredient.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of example or data about how it fares as a singular ingredient on a
Yeah,
dish?
absolutely. It's definitely been used and been served in multiple instances. So just at Mandala Club, a few just shortly down the road, it's being served. The foie gras that we have is being served as its own starter, just with the meat itself. In many other instances, it's actually being topped on top of Wagyu beef or topped on top of a roast beef burger, and that's very intentional, which is that we are really looking for this to be in addition to our diets, not a replacement for the meat that we're eating today, and we want to introduce it as an ingredient, whether that's as a complement to meat that we know today or as its own independent dish because it's worthy of it.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So I guess then the next question would be about price. And how does the price of the Japanese quail compare to quail?
Yep.
And how do you decide on that price point?
Uh,
And I think from the feedback that we're getting on the questions, um, forge parfait is expensive and probably out of reach of most people for now. Do you see a time when it would become affordable and accessible?
Yep, absolutely. The price right now is a reflection of its uniqueness in market and its inability to actually get it widely as easily as you can get beef in market right now. The reality is that the cultured meat is on its way to scaling and to proving its pathway to economic viability, which is essentially a factor of how quickly can we produce, at what volumes, and how can that actual cost curve come down as we start to have the capability to produce more and more of it. The positive news as it pertains to our costs is we are well on our way to that, being able to prove our pathway to actually being able to bring costs down from hundreds of kilos all the way down to tens of dollars per kilo. And so we're really using a combination of what are people willing to pay for it with what is the affordability of meat today, and actually introduce it in ingredients and in dishes that are affordable to us. So you'll find at Two Men Bagel House, for example, the foie gras bagel is served at $21, which is just on the same price point that all of their other bagel offerings are. And so we're really seeking to work with partners to introduce this ingredient at a price point that is affordable and accessible to people as they're experiencing a new dish.
Oh, that's cool. I think we just got one time for just like one last question, and I think this one's quite interesting. Suppose say we manage to put the mammoth and the giraffe on the supermarket. Like, how do you navigate regulatory approvals,
Yes.
especially in countries who might be a little bit adverse to putting a giraffe on a supermarket shelf?
Yep, absolutely. I always joke that myself and my head of legal are always trading places and answering questions on each other's behalf. This is one where the regulatory environment differs so differently by region. So in the US, it looks very different than it looks in Singapore or Australia or the UK. So we really have to adapt our approach for new ingredients, really aligned with how that government or how that country actually sees it. The way that we've done it on our end is we've partnered with countries that have quite novel and innovative approaches to food regulation, and where we believe that there's audiences of consumers and of eaters that are quite open-minded and where food culture is thriving. So that's what really led the choice to come to Singapore, where Singapore has quite a novel and innovative approach. We've gotten approval at the ingredient level, so for Japanese quail at large. And as we introduce new species or new animals into our ability to manufacture them, essentially we'll be able to submit regulatory approvals for each independent animal species on its own. So it's a combination of how we're actually introducing species with how the government itself actually sees food approvals and food restrictions, et cetera. The positive news is we already have countries like Australia and New Zealand and their food authorities due to approve cultured meat within the coming months, which is very exciting. Regions like the UK have just established a regulatory sandbox for other cultured meat companies to partner together to explore how we can introduce something novel into our food systems safely and credibly as well. So it kind of differs, I guess, depending on where you are in the world, but we've done so effectively so far with Singapore and then soon to be Australia and New Zealand.
Exciting news. Okay, thank you very much, Dalia. Round of applause, I suppose.